Indian-administered Kashmir, one of the most militarized places on earth, has been the scene of violent unrest over the past 5 months since security forces killed a young separatist fighter, Burhan Wani. More than 90 people have died and thousands have been injured, some deliberately blinded by Indian security forces, according to human rights groups. So, are those Kashmiris who favour independence from India any closer to realising that goal? And who's to blame for all the bloodshed? Joining me now are two guests, both originally from Indian-administered Kashmir and both Muslims. But Athar Zia, Professor of Anthropology at the University of Northern Colorado and founder of online journal Kashmir Lit, is in favour of Kashmiri independence from India, while Suale Keen, writer, critic and founder of Kashmir Oral History, is in favour of being part of India. Thank you both for joining me on Upfront in the arena. Athar Zia, briefly make for our global audience the case for Kashmiri independence in your view.
Thank you very much, Mehdi, for having me. I think Kashmir is an idea whose time has come, and I think Kashmiri people have given a referendum in blood, and these past 3 months have proved that. And when we have to make a case for Kashmiri independence, I don't think it's a point of making a case, because the case is already made. UN has made Kashmiri people a party to the dispute, and not just India and Pakistan, because the case of Kashmir, it was a country before 1947, even before India and Pakistan were the countries that they are now.
And just to be clear, you want Kashmir, i.e. Indian-administered Kashmir, Pakistan-administered Kashmir, Kashmir on both sides of the unofficial border, the line of control. You want it to be independent, not part of Pakistan, not part of India.
Yes, exactly true.
Suale Keen, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with self-determination in the 21st century?
It's not about self-determination, as it's about the unfinished business of partition. It's about the determination of Pakistan to wrest control from India of this part of J&K. Now, when we characterize this dispute as a Kashmir issue, we are doing injustice to a whole lot of people who are not Kashmiri, whom we club together as Kashmiris. For example, the Indian administered, so-called administered Kashmir is basically 3 divisions. In the south, there is the Jammu division, and in the north, the largest region, that is the Ladakh, and then there is the Kashmir Valley, which is wedged between these 2 regions. Now, it's the demand for secession is only confined to a certain section of people within the valley.
The majority of the population in that part of the world say they want to be independent, according to the polls.
Yeah, it is the majority of the population, but within that majority there are certain communities. There are Shia communities which are not involved in this secessionism. There are Gujars, Bakarwals who are Muslims, but they are not party to it. And there are the Sikhs and the Hindu Pandit minority. So it is not a homogeneous region.
Athar Zia, of course, the polls do show that Kashmiris living in the valley in Indian-administered Kashmir, what India calls Jammu and Kashmir, J&K, the polls show that they do overwhelmingly support either secession, independence, joining with Pakistan, but only 1% of Kashmiri Hindus back independence, and 1 in 3 residents of that part of the world is either Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist or Christian. Should their views be ignored?
Of course not. I do not think that most of the Kashmiris, and I'm taking into consideration all religious denominations, I do not think anyone can be ignored. They're all party to this dispute. But then we also have to look at what the majority decision is, which is heavily for independence. And when you talk about Kashmir Valley, we're talking about 3 provinces, and I agree with Saleh there that we are 3 provinces.
Suale Keen, almost 100 people dead this year, thousands injured, scores detained without charge. Is your view on the recent violence that of the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who says the fundamental reason for disturbances in Kashmir is cross-border terrorism promoted by our neighbouring country, i.e. Pakistan? Is it really that simple? Surely not.
There are many ways of looking at the Kashmir problem. If we look at the victims, the ones who while fighting or attacking the police got injured or killed, if we look at them, they come from very poor socio-economic background. So it is also not just religious extremism, there is also an aspect of economic deprivation. And if we look at the border skirmishes that are happening even today, then it's also a border dispute, and we cannot rule out the Pakistan factor. So I'm saying that it is not just one thing.
You're saying it's lots of things, but I want to ask you a specific question about a specific thing. A recent investigation in the Guardian newspaper called the recent violence in Indian-administered Kashmir, quote, the first instance of a modern democracy systematically and willfully shooting at people to blind them. It said nearly 6,000 civilians had been injured, 972 of them suffered injuries to their eyes. There's no justification for that, is there?
I don't see any country in the world where you have a right to riot or maybe smash the head of a policeman with a stone, and they are not expected to retaliate or defend themselves. Looking at the pellet thing, pellets came to the picture when people demanded a non-lethal mode of mob control, because we all...
So are you okay with the Indian security forces blinding protesters?
I'm not okay with anybody dying or getting injured, even if they are breaking the rules, because finally those are our own people, and we have to find methods in which we can contain their violence without causing any damage to life and limb.
Hold on, Suwale, let Atazia respond to what you've just said. I want you to respond to the point that Suwale raises, which at the end of the day, a lot of these people are quote-unquote militant, separatist, fighters, they're breaking the law. What's your response to that? Not all of them are non-violent protesters. The fighter himself, Burhan Wani,
No.
whose death kicked off all of this, was a quote-unquote jihadist.
And when you say jihadist, to a lot of Kashmiris, he was a freedom fighter. No doubt he was from Hizbul Mujahideen. We have to tackle that reality as well. But what I think is there is a curb, not just a curb, but there is a repressive regime in place in the Indian-controlled Kashmir, in the Indian-held Kashmir. There is no space for dissent. So where do these boys go?
Are you saying that the Indian government, by preventing political dissent, has encouraged violent resistance?
Kashmiris have been the most peaceful in demanding a UN-mandated self-determination plus independence, which they want.
A lot of people at home will be watching and saying, well, look, we do hear a lot about the violence that Indian security forces perpetrate against, against Muslim protesters in the valley. We don't hear so much about the violence perpetrated against Hindu families in Indian-administered Kashmir by fighters, by armed groups. Thousands of Hindu families driven from their homes by some of these groups who you say are labelled freedom fighters. What about the injustice done to them?
The injustice done to them, to the pundits, you mean, the
Yes.
Kashmiri pundits? Well, I think it's the most painful and traumatic period in Kashmir's freedom movement. I think everyone needs to acknowledge that, and I think people who have been implicated on those crimes have also come back and they've acknowledged those and they've apologized to those people. I think a lot of reconciliation has taken place.
Suwale is shaking his head. Why are you shaking your head, Suwale? You disagree?
There has been no reconciliation and all. In fact, ever since militancy erupted in 1989 in Kashmir, the whole fabric of the society has been torn apart. It's not just Hindus who fled. At that time, droves of Muslims and other minorities also fled to escape from them. What we are experiencing is a civil war. And I dispute this, that the majority of Kashmiris, the ethnic, real, bona fide Kashmiris are in favor of this thing. Because if you see, what are the parameters we judge by? There is also 65% voting, means like people who believe in the Indian democratic system. Now we have to understand the people who vote are not the same people who pelt stones.
Atazia, we're running out of time. Briefly respond to what Suwale is saying about the voting.
What I think India is imposing is not a democracy. It's a politics of democracy, where elections is made into a motive of everything is normalized. Go and ask the people how elections are used. And if you look at occupation law, I think elections are to be held. There is nothing for governance. What else do you do with these people who need water, who need power, who need roads? That's why they go for. This is a politics of democracy happening in Kashmir. It's not a democracy. It's an internment camp. It's a siege.
Do you believe there will be independence for Kashmir in the next 10, 20, 30 years?
I don't know how long the struggle is going to be, but Kashmiris are used to a long resilience. So we do not know what we are dealing with here, how long it is going to be. But you do see a strong anti-India sentiment.
Okay, well, let me put that as a last question to Suwale Keen. How long can India hold on to a state of, what it calls a state of its own, Jammu and Kashmir, where the majority of people don't seem to want to be part of that state, and where the violence There are mass detentions, curfews, killings, rapes. You can't just undo that. That legacy is there, Suwane.
In my opinion, human rights violation cannot be a justification for seeking freedom, because the freedom fighters murdered as many as 13,000 Kashmiri Muslims. Now, no human rights activist is talking about that. So, solution part one would be to convert the LOC into the international border, so that people can say, okay, this is a fait accompli, this is a done deed. Okay, what next? Another thing is that we have to address the religious radicalization that's prevalent in the valley. And third thing is that we have to also look at the socioeconomic factors that are leading children from poor family towards violence.
Atazia, last word, very briefly. We've only got a few seconds.
Well, I do want to kind of like say that look at Kashmir not as a bilateral dispute between India and Pakistan. It's not as simple as converting the LOC, the ceasefire line, into an international border. It's not that easy. You have to look at history. You have to look at what Kashmir is about. It's about self-determination, and this is UN mandated.
Okay.
It's about independence.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you both for joining me on Upfront. That's our show. Upfront will be back next week.